Welcome to our second study on Epiphany. This one is the Star of Bethlehem. We're going to begin with the John Hopkins carol, O Star of Wonder, Star of Night. That's what I want to talk about here. Star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. You know, when you read the story of the wise men in Matthew chapter 2, those first 12 verses, it has been suggested that the Star of Bethlehem was some sort of planetary conjunction. Interesting. Maybe Jupiter and Saturn or whatever. Or maybe it was a comet. Some people say, no, it was a supernova or a so-called new star. But each of these possibilities actually has rather grave, I think, difficulties. It was John of Chrysostom, 4th century Antioch, one of the leaders of the church and a very good sermon writer, by the way, St. John Chrysostom, who said, "For you know that a spot of such small dimensions, whether it's a planetary conjunction or a comet or even a supernova, for you know that a spot of such small dimensions, being only as much as a shed, manger in Bethlehem would occupy, or rather as much as the body of a little infant would take up, could not possibly be marked out by a star." And when you start to think about it, you know, I mean, John Chrysostom, living in Antioch in the 4th century, says, how could that possibly be? How could a star actually lead these wise men westward to an actual house where they find the toddler Jesus at the age of 2? That's a good question. He says, could not possibly be marked out by a star, for by reasons of the star's immense height, it could not sufficiently distinguish so confined a spot. Now that's something to really think about, you see. Well, what I found in my research is that the ancients, I mean from long ago, from at least, before the 5th century before Christ, the ancients actually looked at stars very differently than we do. Yeah. You see, they actually believed that the stars were living beings. I mean, the ancient Greeks and Romans named the planets like Mars in the Roman context, or Ares in the Greek, or Venus or Aphrodite in the Greek. They named these planets not just to honor the planets. They actually believed that the planets were these deities, you see. And for a long time, stars were understood to be living beings. You can read a lot about that actually in the Second Temple period, in the various documents that were popular from around the 5th century before Christ, 6th century before Christ. The temple was rededicated. It was rebuilt and rededicated, I think, in 510 BC. So that's the Second Temple period until about the 3rd century AD. These were the documents that actually influenced Jesus. You have First Enoch, chapter 43, or chapter 86, or chapter 90. Second Enoch, chapter 29, Third Enoch, chapter 46. You have other writers like Pseudo-Philo in his Liber Antiquarium Baecarium, chapter 32, or Joseph and Asneth, Testament of Solomon, Babylonian Talmud, Avodah Zarah. These are all Second Temple period documents that speak of stars as living beings. And in fact, I have a whole collection of them right here, where I've gone through these documents and actually highlighted the specific texts that speak of stars as living beings. And by the way, it's not only Second Temple documents either. I mean, look at Isaiah chapter 14, beginning at verse 12, going through verse 14. How you were fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. Speaking of the star here as a living being. How you were cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the heights of Zaphon in the far north. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Or again, how about Job chapter 38 in verses 4 through 7, where Job is questioning why God does all this to him. And God says to Job in chapter 38, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together? When the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. You see, back then, they understood the stars to be living beings. Judges chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. The kings came, they fought. These are Canaanite kings. The kings came, they fought, then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. Now listen to this, verse 20. The stars fought from heaven. I mean, this is Judges chapter 5. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses, they fought against Sisera, commander of the Canaanite army of King Jabin of Hatzor. Or look at Revelation chapter 1. I mean, it's not only the Hebrew scriptures, it's also in the Greek scriptures. Revelation chapter 1, beginning at verse 17, going through verse 20. When I saw him, this is John, writing on the island of Patmos, who is granted a vision by God that he writes about in what we know as Revelation. When I saw him, meaning God, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he placed his right hand on me, saying, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever. Now, Jesus, you see, is speaking here. The resurrected Christ is speaking to John on the island of Patmos. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. Now write what you have seen, what is and what is to take place after this. As for the mystery of the 7 stars, now listen to this. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. And the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So, in other words, stars back then were understood as angelic beings, if you will. They were angels, and angels as guides in both the Hebrew and the Greek scriptures. We have here, for instance, in Exodus chapter 14, an angel of God. Now, see, they're now picturing angels as stars. Stars as angels. Exodus chapter 14. The angel of God who was going before the Israelite army moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel. And so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. One did not come near the other all night. So in other words, you see, God uses an angel to guide God's people out of slavery into freedom and eventually into the promised land. Again, Exodus chapter 23, this time verse 20. I am going to send an angel in front of you. This is God now speaking to God's people. I'm going to send an angel in front of you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. So in other words, you see here, an angel, again, is a guide for God's people. And again in Exodus 23, this time verse 23. When my angel goes in front of you and brings you to the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So in other words, you see, God is going to give God's people victory, led by an angel. Psalm 34, verse 7. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. That's the work of angels, you see. Look at the 16th chapter of the Gospel according to Luke now in the Greek scriptures. Luke 16, verses 19 through 22. There was a rich man who dressed in purple and fine linen. It's a wonderful story that Jesus tells. And who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus. By the way, Lazarus means God helps. Covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels, you see, delivered by the angels to Abraham's bosom. And then again in Acts chapter 12, and a very interesting story here about Peter. The very night before Herod was going to bring, this is Herod Antipas, the very night before Herod was going to bring out Peter, bound with 2 chains, was sleeping between 2 soldiers, while guards in front of the door were keeping watch over the prison. So in other words, Peter here is imprisoned in Jerusalem. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in his cell. He tapped Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his wrists. The angel said to him, "Fasten your belt and put on your sandals." He did so. Then he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." See, the angel now is a guide for Peter in prison. Peter went out and followed him. He did not realize that what was happening with the angel's help was real. He thought he was seeing a vision. After they had passed the first and the second guard, they came before the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord. And they went outside, the angel and Peter, they went outside, and walked along a lane when suddenly the angel left him. Now that Peter was out of prison and safe, now the angel leaves him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hands of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." So in other words, I think it's altogether possible to consider the Star of Bethlehem to actually be an angel that led these wise men from the east west to where Jesus was a 2-year-old child. Again, the beautiful prayer, "O star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light."